All right, we are live. Dishtale and Hakar Sang, everybody. Thank you for being here and joining us from all networks. This talk is hosted by International Tibet Network, and we're happy to have everybody joining us from all parts of the world. So, today, as we speak, Tibet is one of the least free places on earth for political and civil liberties. The situation inside of Tibet continues to worsen every day. Right now, China is carrying out an eliminationist project with 80% of Tibetan children as young as 4 and 5 years old in colonial state-run boarding schools. Millions of nomads being displaced. The environment being degraded. And for today's discussion, Human Rights Watch and Citizens Lab have reported that the Chinese government has launched a full-scale campaign of biometric repression against Tibetans, forcibly collecting their DNA. Thermo Fisher, a Massachusetts-based company, is aiding and abetting China to steal Tibetan DNA. So today with us, we've got a stellar lineup of panelists. We're going to do it in two parts, an expert panel and follow up by a panel with 3 grassroots activists. And for the first panel, I'm very happy to introduce you to our first panelist, Pema Doma. Pema Doma is a Tibetan American human rights and climate activist. She currently serves as the ED, Executive Director of Students for Free Tibet. She has advocated for Tibet's environment at the US Congress, United Nations of Human Rights Council, and on the streets, joining millions of youth activists from around the world during climate strikes and people's marches. She is an inspiration for many young Tibetans. Thank you and welcome, Pema Doma. Next up, we have Sophie Richardson. Sophie Richardson serves as the China Director at Human Rights Watch. She has overseen the organization's research and advocacy on China since 2006 and has published extensively on human rights and political reform in the country across Southeast Asia. Dr. Richardson is the author of China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, an in-depth examination on China's foreign policy since 1954's Geneva Conference, including the rare interviews with Chinese policymakers. Thanks, Sophie, for being here today. Next up, we have Shonda Gupta, who's a campaigner for justice and liberation. Based in the UK, Shonda is a freelance campaigner on issues of human rights, justice, and liberation. She has previously worked for Runnymede, Greenpeace UK, ECHO, which is formerly known as Some of Us. She has been a spokesperson for various campaigns, including one that targeted Apple's censorship in regions of Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong. Thanks, Shonda, for being here. Next up, we have John Jones. John Jones is the head of campaigns policy research at Free Tibet. He is based in London and has collaborated in various corporate campaigns with the Tibetan movement. Thank you all for being here today. It's a pleasure to have all of you familiar faces at this section. You know, we're gathered here today on this special day because today marks Thermo Fisher's annual general meeting. And last I checked, our petition that has been going online officially has over 25,471 signatures. And yesterday we had representatives from the Tibetan movement in all parts of the world taking on an action to deliver petitions at the headquarters and various locations in India and Canada and so forth. Hundreds of tweets have been sent leading up to this day, the AGM, and so many actions have taken place. So now let's start off with Pema. Pema, could you tell us about the implications of this for Tibetans inside and outside Tibet?
Sure. Thank you so much, Chimi, for the really thorough explanation and introduction to the issue. I think I remember back in August of last year when the Human Rights Watch report and the Citizens Lab report had first come out, and Tibetans around the world began hearing this news that there had been some trickling of information here and there about DNA collection sites or instances where people felt they were, like coercively had their DNA taken. But this compilation of information in August, that was really the first time where we really, as a community and worldwide, knew the scope and scale of this initiative by the Chinese government. And the first thing I remember thinking about was, inside Tibet right now, there's a 5-year-old who's had their DNA taken from them In 20 years from now, if Tibet is still occupied by China, will that 5-year-old think twice about speaking out about human rights violations? Would they question whether their actions, their right to free speech, should be a trade-off with the right to having a safe family, to protecting their children or their mother? And a lot of people talk about, the world turning into an Orwellian state, in some cases with mass surveillance by authoritarian regimes. But I think the Chinese government has completely taken it like absolutely beyond to the next step with this new initiative with the DNA surveillance. And not only Tibetans, but Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, really everyone that's living under authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes are put at increased risk because of the policies that the Chinese government has implemented. And for Tibetans around the world, I think there was a collective moment of, wow, like, what can we do? This is such a big thing. What can we possibly do to affect change or impact this situation? We see our Tibetans, our fellow brothers and sisters, our fellow Tibetans inside Tibet. We want to do something. We need to do something in solidarity with them. But what do we do when there is such an issue that's this big, this wide, this overreaching, this invasive, as like stealing of the very blood and DNA of our people? And I think there was a moment in which people just felt like, what do we do? And I think in that sense, this campaign has come together and really given that direction. And the direction is that the first thing that we have to address in this DNA campaign is making sure that there is no foreign complicity. There are no companies that are claiming to be, leaders in inclusion and ethical science also operating in this space. There is no overlap. That just doesn't exist. And any company claiming that an overlap could exist is just completely basing itself off of off of lies. But thank you, Jimmy, for the question.
No, thank you. Pema, your video is getting a little stuck, but we could hear you. The audio is just fine, so I'll let you continue on. Thank you, Pema, for
Sure
really
thing. Thanks,
bringing
Jimmy.
in that perspective of the implications of Tibetans inside and outside Tibet. You referenced the Human Rights Watch and Citizen Lab report, which makes me want to bring in Sophie Richardson in this conversation. This report has been really crucial in highlighting China's biometric repression. Perhaps you can comment on that and also talk about any interactions that you folks may have had with Thermo Fisher specifically.
Or tried to. It's actually been almost 6 years. Well, first of all, I should say it's really an honor to be here with you and to work in solidarity on these issues that are absolutely chilling, as Pamela has just described. But it's been actually almost exactly 6 years since we first wrote to Thermo Fisher. And we have yet to see the company publish the kind of human rights due diligence strategy that we've been asking for all along. Maybe I can explain briefly that our position about what companies ought to do derives from the 2011 United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that essentially sets out a positive, an affirmative obligation for companies to conduct what's called human rights due diligence, to make sure that their business operations aren't creating or contributing to human rights violations, and if they find those, to remedy them. Right. So the position is not necessarily that companies should just roll up their operations and go someplace else. They should try to do this kind of work. It was in the summer of, or over the course of 2017, when we were doing more research into the Chinese government's use of surveillance and arbitrary collection of biometrics in the Uyghur region, that we first came upon documents showing that Thermo Fisher was selling DNA sequencers to the police in that region. And while we weren't ever able to show definitively that Thermo Fisher sequencers were used in abusive interactions, nevertheless, the larger context certainly raised questions about whether Thermo Fisher had put any strategies in place to make sure that the sequencers weren't being used in that way. And so we first wrote to them in June of 2017, and we got a very bland answer that, among other things, said, quote, "We expect customers to act in accordance with approved regulations and industry standard best practices." Now, anybody who thinks that those are the rules of the road for the police in the Uyghur region is just clearly woefully uninformed, right? This is a law enforcement body nationwide that regularly violates human rights. We wrote back in August of 2017, asking them to answer the questions that we had originally put to them, including about their due diligence strategy. They sent a couple of more not very good letters back. The last one, I recall, concluded with something like saying that we should, quote, agree to disagree. We don't agree to disagree. We agree that international law and standards matter, and that this company needs to explain its approaches. It wasn't answering us. We worked with friends in the journalist community and with Congress, who eventually pushed the company to say that it would stop selling that particular technology in that particular region. But by the summer of 21, the New York Times reported that it was still finding Thermo Fisher equipment being used by police and being on-sold in the region. The following summer, Citizen Lab and the amazing Emil Dirks was starting to share information about Thermo Fisher's role across Tibetan areas, as we were simultaneously putting together what we published in early September, I think, showing the scope and the scale of arbitrary DNA collection across Tibetan areas, which is chilling stuff. And maybe it's worth just mentioning briefly what rights are implicated here. I mean, these are violations of the right to health on a massive scale, both in Tibetan areas and in the Uyghur region. But the arbitrary collection of this kind of information constitutes violations of an individual's dignity and privacy and bodily integrity. It can constitute degrading treatment. I think we can reasonably assume that is a problem here. And when technology like this is used in these ways across a whole population, I think it's very clear that the Chinese government has not provided any sort of explanation to show that this campaign is necessary or justified. So we're talking about rights violations on multiple different levels. And maybe I'll just stop by saying that again, 6 years, Thermo Fisher, what is your human rights due diligence strategy with respect to the Chinese government's use of your technology in Tibetan and Uyghur regions?
Thank you, Sophie. That is perfectly put to bring in Pema into the conversation. But before I bring in Pema, I want to let the audience know that this expert panel is here for the next X amount of minutes. I want to encourage every single one of you to ask any questions. If you have any, post them. We can bring them up, and I can see your live comments as we go. We are live on Facebook and YouTube and other platforms. So if you have any questions, please post them, and we'll make sure to take it on as we go. Okay, perfect. So Pema, can you bring us back into the context of the Thermo Fisher campaign? So 6 long years, as Sophie has mentioned, and SFT has been doing phenomenal work along with the Tibetan network, holding Thermo Fisher accountable, right? And so can you give us a brief background on some of the actions that SFT has been leading and the current status of the campaign, where we're at?
Sure, Chimila, thank you for the question. So as the campaign began rolling, when these reports came out, and a lot of Tibetan activists from different organizations began thinking there's got to be something that we can do about this really important issue. And in that way, the campaign started rolling. Really, the big first kind of opening to the campaign was a joint letter, which was signed by over 100 human rights and Tibet groups from around the world, which was sent to Thermo Fisher in November. Following that, there have been 2 additional joint letters sent into Thermo Fisher, as well as this petition, which just recently passed 25,000 signatories. And those that are listening today, please continue signing and sharing this petition, because it's really going to be kind of the voice of the international community in our dialogue with the company, with Thermo Fisher. So following these letters and engagements with the company from our side, the company still hasn't agreed to meet with any Tibetan representatives. They haven't agreed to listen to a single voice of a Tibetan person who wants to educate them on this issue and the concerns and risk factors that are involved. And also human rights experts such as Sophie Richardson, who, like Human Rights Watch, who have themselves written this report detailing such horrendous human rights violations and, honestly, like long-term security risks for the entire world, truly, really, truly. And the company just hasn't agreed to listen to any of these voices. And that in and of itself is really the first alarming and concerning aspect. Following this, other bodies have also gotten involved. The Congressional Executive Commission on China, the CECC, which is a bicameral commission in the United States with members of both the House and the Senate involved, have actually sent a letter as well to Thermo Fisher, expressing their concerns about this about the company's involvement in this mass, widespread, sweeping DNA collection effort in Tibet, and also IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which represents members of Parliament and Congress from around the world, have also joined into the issue, and sent in a letter as well to the company's CEO, Mark Casper. But till this date, Mark Casper hasn't taken the time of day to listen to a single voice of a human rights expert or a Tibetan person. And around the world, we've seen from Japan to India to the Netherlands to Switzerland, all over the US and the UK, we've seen people taking action on this, calling on Thermo Fisher to take action as well as soon as possible. And some of the young people that are here later in the panel will also speak on that. So,
thank you, Pema. So many efforts have been made to be able to reach out to Mark Casper, the company, and clearly there has been no response. And for me, growing up in both parts of the world, any company is liable to their shareholders or its organization, right? And so I want to bring in Shonda here in this conversation and talk about, what are the shareholder responsibilities, and also how do we ensure to hold Thermo Fisher accountable for not selling these products that are literally forcibly taking DNA and blood samples out of Tibetans, and that's not just a small amount of people, which is completely not acceptable. We're talking about 1/3 of the Tibetan population whose DNA has been forcibly collected for children as young as even 5 years old. So, Shonda, please enlighten us about shareholder responsibilities on this topic.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me again on this panel and to campaign alongside you. It's nice being with old friends. So when we think of how we target companies to do the right thing, often our mind goes to consumer boycotts, and that can certainly be a very powerful tool. So certainly from my formative years, I always think of the campaign that started in the UK that was run by students to boycott Barclays over its investments in apartheid South Africa. A campaign that did win, went on for 13 long years, but obviously as consumers, you're somewhat limited when you have a company like Thermo Fisher that doesn't really have a public retail face, or if companies are so specialist that they hold a strong market share, or if all the companies moving in that space move in the same way or behave in the same way. But shareholders are investing in this company, right? Your money is going in for this company to make money for you, and that's often what people think is the primary responsibility, provide shareholder value, but also the acceptance that companies are things that we build and we create, and they're there to serve us, all of us as well, and not cause harm. And many investors and shareholders increasingly don't want their money to be party to causing harm anywhere in the world, and so they have sort of rights and power and some responsibilities to challenge companies in that regard. So it was shareholder pressure that facilitated by many people on this call, that led to Apple publishing its first ever human rights policy as late as 2020. It did take a long time to get them there. And last year, shareholders at companies as diverse as Johnson & Johnson, Home Depot and McDonald's all voted for resolutions calling for civil rights or race equality audits. There is definitely an appetite of growing investors of conscience to push companies to do the right thing, to abide by the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, to have good, robust policies and practices and the procedures that they put in place to follow those policies to ensure their investors aren't inadvertently or unwittingly causing harm to people across the globe. And it's also worth remembering that many of us don't own shares directly in companies, right? But a lot of us do have pension funds or superannuation funds or mutual funds, and those are invested on our behalf. And that is another route where we can pressure our fund managers to vote for resolutions, raise questions at company meetings, to push companies to be responsible and ethical with their investments. And it's very important that we network in that way, both with and people who are impacted, communities that are impacted by the company's decisions, and with other shareholders, so we can be a stronger voice, a weight against the big institutional investors that have a lot of shares at companies. But between us, we can make a lot of noise, and we can push companies definitely to do the right thing. You can also, as a shareholder, any shareholder can attend an AGM, can turn up, ask a question, probe the company. And that's a very powerful thing to do. And any individual can do that. And they can also transfer their proxy for somebody else to attend. And you could think of that as in terms of reparatory justice, I think, in a way, because who is most likely to hold that power and that money and that investment, and who's most likely to be affected by the decisions the company has made? So as individual shareholders, you could appoint a proxy from someone who's an impacted community and get them to go along to a meeting and ask questions about the harm that their company is causing.
Yeah, for sure. And everyone has the right to know, specifically shareholders, that a company that they've invested in is not only selling products to China, their kits are being used to violate human rights and privacy. And Shada, thank you so much for that, because you really touched on the ethical considerations of this company as well. And so I want to bring in John here to dive a little deeper into the ethical considerations of being involved in supplying DNA kits to police forces inside of Tibet.
Sure, happy to do that. I think some of this is going to be a bit of a retread of Sophie's answer when she spoke about how Thermo Fisher tried to play the questions about its activities in the Uyghur region, because you've seen this same lack of curiosity and this same defensive tone from them. So Thermo Fisher Scientific's governance and ethics document refers to the Declaration of Helsinki, which I'm reliably informed requires informed consent from subjects before they provide biological samples and without coercion. And Thermo Fisher Scientific have shown very little concern about how these ethical standards apply to Tibet. We've seen no effort on their part to interrogate whether sending DNA testing kits and sequencers to occupy Tibet is feeding in to a mass collection carried out by the police of DNA from, according to some estimates, 1.2 million Tibetans, including young children. Could these things be connected? Thermo Fisher is deeply uncurious. Instead, they tend to resort to dancing around, making claims like the ones in their response to the Congressional Executive Commission on China, where they just ignored the question and said, our DNA kits can be used to help the police to identify disaster victims and solve crimes. And at that point, you sort of get the image of perhaps an arms dealer selling guns to a war zone and then trying to explain, no, guns can be used to hunt deer, or they can be used on shooting ranges. You think, well, there's another connection you can make here. Do you have any reflections on the scale of the DNA collection, which seems wildly disproportionate? Do you have any reflections on the fact that this DNA collection is racially targeted? How about the fact that this DNA collection is ripping to shreds international standards on rights to health or privacy? These are the main issues, and I think there needs to be an acknowledgement on the company's part that Tibet is not a typical policing environment. When the company talks about helping police solve crimes, the crimes that they're talking about will include things like discussing human rights, owning a Tibetan flag, wishing happy birthday to the Dalai Lama, singing a patriotic song. These are not crimes that typically need DNA collection for the police to solve them. The police tend to steam in, detain Tibetans, charge them with state security crimes. There's a above 99% conviction rate and long prison sentences. Instead, what you're doing by supplying DNA kits in this environment is supporting a surveillance state that has been imposed with the very express aim of keeping an occupation stable and making sure that not only can the police crack down on things like protest and dissent, but that protest and dissent are not even allowed to bubble under the surface. The whole thing stinks of a sort of pre-crime operation where Tibetans are treated as a suspect. Thermo Fisher don't seem to get this. We're hoping that their shareholders do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. What a stellar panel we have here. Everyone has brought in so many different perspectives, all adding into this complex situation that is really much more in millions of multitudes of challenges that Tibetans inside of Tibet are facing on the grounds. I do see a question in from online. I want to take it up. It is for Sophie. So, Sophie, can you please talk about the impact of Thermo Fisher's actions on the company's reputation in the long term? John, it's a perfect segue from John because John just highlighted the amount of repression inside of Tibet. And so, what are the implications on the reputation of Thermo Fisher? Sophie?
Yeah, John, that was brilliant. And I think it's very charitable to describe Thermo Fisher as incurious as opposed to willfully rejecting important information that they have to respond to. They have an obligation to respond to that. But your point about what protest or free speech in China could result in and the authorities' responses to protests, let's recall that at least under US law, one of the surviving Tiananmen era sanctions prevents US manufacturers from selling certain kinds of equipment like handcuffs and crowd control equipment to the public security bureaus across China. It does not prohibit the sale of things like DNA sequencers. And one of the points that we have tried to make to policymakers is that these sanctions are woefully out of date in reflecting what kind of technology the Chinese Public Security Bureau wants. And that, I think, is a real area for governments to focus on longer term. In terms of the reputational risks, look, when in the universe I operate in here in Washington and in some European capitals, when Thermo Fisher's name comes up, members of Congress will say, that's the company that sold DNA sequencers to Chinese police, isn't it? I think there's some real long-term reputational harm. And again, the best way to respond to that is to be honest. Tell us what your human rights due diligence strategy is. And if that presents obstacles that cannot be surmounted, the company shouldn't be doing business there. It's that simple.
Yeah, for sure. And this, I want to bring in Shonda here because Shonda, you have also been advocating in various platforms, holding these large companies accountable when they have these type of actions or partnerships that clearly have serious ethical implications. I want to bring you in here to do a comment to connect the pieces of shareholder responsibilities, ethical implications, and really holding companies such as Thermo Fisher accountable.
Yes, sorry, it took me a moment to unmute there. Sure. I mean, companies thrive on having a good reputation, right? People, you feel like you want to do business with a company. It feels pretty distasteful to be doing business with a company either as an individual consumer or as a large purchaser, and certainly for Thermo Fisher, they supply universities and research departments and the scientific community as well, to be increasing the value and the profits in a company that is engaged in harm. It is engaged in harming people, particularly if you think of medical and scientific research as, broadly speaking, these are people who want the human race to do better, to be healthier, to be freer, to live better lives. There's a sort of real value in that. And to be, on the one hand, driving your work forward to improve the lot of humanity, well, on the one hand, and on the other hand, buying your equipment from a company that's aiding and abetting some really awful and repressive and disgusting practices, is a problem for that company's reputation. And as companies have bad reputation, that feeds into shareholder value. So you do get back, as we do operate in a capitalist world, people invest in companies because they want to make money out of them. And if they're not making money out of them, if they don't, maybe not au fait with the details of what's happening, their value, the value that they get from that company will go down. But that's only going to happen if enough of us talk about it, raise questions, and keep raising questions. I think often a shortcoming as campaigners is that we do one thing and then we jump on to the next. Our researchers on the call are people who will continue plugging away on things for years and years and years. But campaigners will tend to run a campaign, get to an AGM, and then move on to the next one. Where really with this sort of work, we are talking about much longer term engagement and sustained engagement over a period of time. And it doesn't have to be an awfully long period of time. It could just be 2 or 3 years, which does feel long, but in the life of a company, that's sort of a perfectly reasonable speed that they work with. So maintaining that pressure and keep plugging away, and just keep raising the issue. If it just appears on one day and we all talk about it on one day and then it goes away, companies can ride that storm. Like you have your public relations policies to deal with adverse press that are a crisis moment. But if you're constantly raising this issue all the time, it's much harder to knock that away and to put a lid on it.
Thank you, Shonda. This is like amazing content for later on. I can't wait to tackle these questions of long-term sustenance of this movement with the grassroots activists. But before we let this expert panel go, I've got 2 last questions. I'm going to put them into one. There's 2 questions. They are: can any of the panelists describe how CCP is collecting DNA illegally from Tibetans and Uyghurs and its negative impacts? There's also another question that says, how does DNA kits being sold to Chinese police enhance the level of surveillance and repression inside of Tibet? So both these questions, similar. I would love for John to take this on, and maybe Pema, you can add anything right after that, and we'll close off from there.
Okay, I think you're going to get the genetics for dummies answer from me, because I think really a scientist will give you a more complete picture of how the police can use DNA. But effectively, it's the sensitive information that it holds, not just about tying people to family members, but also about things like medical conditions and disabilities that they may have. So collecting DNA and then holding it somewhere without the informed consent gives you further power over an already heavily surveyed population. In addition to that, it goes back to some of the things that I mentioned in my presentation about things like the international standards on the right to health and the right to privacy being stripped away. Whenever you're considering these DNA sales, it has to be considered in the context that Tibet is already an incredibly tight surveillance state, with police monitoring all communications on the street, on the borders. DNA is probably one of the last refuges of privacy that Tibetans had until this collection program started. And for that now to be stripped away and for the police to be able to build up this database, I just think makes them even more vulnerable to things like collective punishment and being monitored. And also, it's slight speculation, but giving someone power to look at your medical conditions when you're not giving them your consent and when there's a risk of torture in Tibet also opens up very disturbing possibilities.
Pema?
Sure, thanks, Jimmy. Thanks, John, as well. That was very good DNA for dummies. Just kidding. But I also think like when you move beyond, like when you think about what are the impacts on the ground, when you move beyond the direct consequences, I also think about the situation we have inside Tibet right now, where over 160 Tibetans have self-immolated, and Tibet is ranked as the least free country or territory in the entire world, tied with Syria and South Sudan. I think like when you think about what the implications are for Tibet and what the implications are for the Tibetan people, frankly, it's quite terrifying. I don't really even, if this DNA database is to continue, if it's to continue to grow, if it's to become a circumstance in which 80 or 90 or 99% of Tibetans are cataloged within these databases by the Chinese government, I think that the level of repression, the just like even the air that Tibetans breathe in will be one in which there is no freedom. And the situation inside Tibet is already possibly one of the most repressive places in the entire earth, where Tibetans really truly can't even fathom the conditions of life, and many of them have chosen to take actions such as self-immolation. So I think that in terms of the social impacts in Tibet, it would definitely be very detrimental.
Thank you so much. And I know, Sophie, you have to leave. Thank you so much. We are wrapping up our expert panel right here. I saw one last comment that said from Kate about the linkages and possible. Yes, thank you. That there's this chilling possibility that these kids could be possibly linked to organ harvesting. And so I want to give the expert panel maybe last minute if you want to comment on this or any final words before I let you go. Anyone? Shonda, I see you unmuted.
I won't comment on this question. I will comment. I'll give you an action-focused last word, which is don't be a passive shareholder. Find out where your money is being invested. Connect with campaign groups or sort of the campaign investment groups. There's people like Tulip Share in the UK and Make My Money Matter and Share Action. Loads of people doing great work using the power of your investments to change company behavior. So don't be passive about it.
For sure. Thank you so much. All right, folks. Now we're going to wrap up the expert panel because we have another stellar lineup of grassroots activists who are young Tibetans born in exile and who time and time again choose to work in the movement and specifically in this campaign have been very active. So without spending much time diving into them, I would love for them to share their stories. So first and foremost, we have Kunsel, president of SFT Rotterdam. We have Tinley, who's part of TYAE and many direct actions. You've seen them in many photos of direct actions. And next up, we have Taeyang, who is currently a science student at Harvard, but also involved with Students for Free Tibet in New York, New Jersey, and HQ. And again, very active. I don't think anyone who's online and looks up some of the movement work that has been happening lately will miss any of the three of your faces. So thank you so much for joining us here today. And more importantly, the work that you've been doing so far. So I want to ask you first and foremost, what brings you here? You know, what time and time again makes you and drives you to do work in this movement and specifically this campaign? Today is the AGM. We've done so much work leading up to this AGM, from petitions to online actions, strategic nonviolence actions in various tactics. So let me bring up Kunsel first. Tell us a little bit more about what brings you here.
Hi, thank you, Chimilamo, for that kind introduction. Firstly, I'm really grateful to be here because the Thermo Fisher campaign is incredibly important to me. As a young Tibetan, I am incredibly worried. I am worried for the Tibetans inside of Tibet, for the Tibetans outside of Tibet, and what this DNA database means to our movement. And the consequences of this DNA database are severe. Our family and friends inside of Tibet are facing pressure in an unprecedented manner. And my heart breaks when I think about a 5-year-old girl waiting in line at their local school to be forced to give her blood to the Chinese government. And my heart breaks when I think about the lack of response from the international community. So in my opinion, Thermo Fisher must be held accountable by us activists, but also by stakeholders, by governments, and by the people watching right now. And I believe there's also so much stakeholders and shareholders can achieve if we speak up together. So that's what brings me here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to bring in Tile.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Jimmy. I think as a Tibetan and a youth myself, I feel a huge responsibility to fight for especially the kids, the most vulnerable people inside Tibet, the kids. So not only because they're literally being lined up for blood extraction without consent, but also looking at the Tibetan kids inside Chinese colonial boarding schools with their purpose of eradication of Tibetan identity. I have no other word for that than saying that's totally messed up. And for the question of why I do what I do, I feel like activists are literally the coolest people, because their motivation is the well-being of others. I think there's nothing cooler than that. Activism means self-empowerment. It's a tool to make the powerful listen to you, take you also serious, and create dialogue, right? So I feel like activists call for justice in various ways where systems and politics fail.
Powerful. And last but not the least, Xiang, tell us more about what brings you here and your involvement in the campaign as well.
Sure, thank you, Jimmy, and also for the amazing lineup of panelists that have spoke before me, who have relatively done all the heavy lifting and make my life so much easier. But mass DNA collection, as we've heard time and time again, is China's most recent effort to conduct biometric surveillance in the most chilling ways possible, from profiling and villainizing Tibetans as young as 5 years old in their very own schools and educational centers, to potentially suppressing Tibetan activists around the world with the threat of their own family's safety. And at its core, it is China's method of stretching the scope of genocidal tactics that can be excused under the name of stability and control. And if we can excuse their endeavors today, who knows what will be in store for us tomorrow. That is why I feel obligated to be here and to do all the work that I do in this campaign.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's truly very inspirational to see such young Tibetans actively involved, and not just involved. I see you folks at the forefront of a lot of the organizing, and so thank you so much for the work that you've done so far, and you continue to do each and every single moment. I want to bring in Chile here and ask, I've seen you in so many direct actions and grassroots initiatives. Always a photo. It's just like not the most attractive face when you're in a direct action, including me. I've been photographed like that. So I want to touch on your role in grassroots initiatives, direct actions, and also touch on what is the role of or what role does consumer pressure play? Because many of the strategic nonviolence actions of direct actions, of grassroots initiatives, are really to build pressure, right? Build pressure and in furthering our advocacy. And so, can you tell us a little bit more about the role of consumer pressure and activism, specifically holding Thermo Fisher accountable?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I tried to cover everything you said. Thanks to campaigns from various Tibetan human rights organizations, the situation of the oppressed Tibetans was made very clear. Decision makers such as Mark Casper himself know what their company is doing now. They are complicit in major human rights violations by the CCP and their genocidal practices. So this complicity, in my opinion, is a crime and should also be treated so, right? So employees, decision makers, and consumers of this company are now in charge of holding this company accountable. By refusing to accept the petition we delivered yesterday at their headquarters, they once again clearly and actively chose to be on the wrong side of history. It sounds brutal, but it's pretty much the truth. We demanded Thermo Fisher to cut their ties to the CCP and won't rest until our job is done. At the end of the day, everyone, whether shareholder, employee, or random viewers of this wonderful panel, can participate also in our fight for justice. So I feel like, how can anyone participate in what we do? It's maybe by commenting on Thermo Fisher's social media and tell them what you think about them. Tell your friends and family about what's going on inside Tibet. Also, consider donating money to organizations to keep such important campaigns as the Thermo Fisher campaign running as long as it needs to. And especially if you're young and have a lot of semshuk, a lot of motivation, then join organizations like TYAE or SFT or other youth organizations.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's phenomenal to see the work that all of these organizations and individuals are taking up the initiative to hold Thermo Fisher accountable. And I've been seeing a lot of it online as well. I want to bring in Kunsel here to talk about, really the shareholder pressure that is created when we engage in such actions.
Sorry. Yes. I think what Tinda said was very strong. This sense of accountability and that Thermo Fisher needs to be held accountable. Thermo Fisher has that accountability coded. Thermo Fisher has a corporate social responsibility, which quote unquote reflects their commitment to humanity, their stakeholders, and to environmental, social, blah, blah, blah. But firms participate often in these principles for responsible investments to advance their commercial interests, but often without a serious commitment to actually protect the human rights of their stakeholders. And what happens then is that under-resourced NGOs often have to call upon to supply the know-how to drive sustainable change. And this often causes disappointment. But disappointment is not despair. And as Sana said, it is important to constantly raise the issue. Yet here I'd like to emphasize that there's a reason this company has written this corporate social responsibility down. The idea of corporate social responsibility is that a company which makes sustainable, responsible decision will become a future-proof company. And as a shareholder, you want a future-proof company. So when consumers are always right, what happens when consumers start questioning the ethics of business practices? And in this case, consumers and shareholders have an immense force to them. It is easy and straightforward. Money is power, and you have the possibility to pull your money out or ensure that your investment is not used for the impression of an entire people. It is simply voting with your wallet. You, as a shareholder or as a consumer, have the power to allow for sustainable change, which leads to a sustainable future. And that's a future without DNA samples being taken away from Tibetan kids at the age of 5 years old.
Thank you. Wow. Very powerful. And speaking of future, the future is really does belong to all of us. We live in a very interconnected world. Every single one of us is part of it. And we live our complex lives with various identities. And specifically as a Tibetan Canadian or Tibetan American, with our, dual identities that we carry, we live the complexities as our future is really held together by our actions, and voting with our wallet is very important. So I want to bring in Tiang into this conversation and say, Tiang, you're a science student studying at Harvard, and also you're a Tibetan who's very active in the movement, a Tibetan advocate. And so how do you bring in these complexities and build towards a future that you want to see and connect with, perhaps our audience that also live very complex lives?
Sure. Thank you for sharing another aspect of my identity that is as integral to me in the context of this campaign, that being an undergraduate student at Harvard studying health sciences. I was raised by a traditional Tibetan medicine doctor, and I've since made it my mission in life to uplift epidemiologically invisible communities and advance ethical healthcare outcomes for my community. So when I first learned about mass DNA collection in Tibet and the involvement and complicity of an American company, a company that is only 30 minutes away from where I study science in Cambridge, I was appalled. I was outraged. And I don't see those two being separate. As I study in classrooms in the hopes of joining the community of leading medical researchers, and as I work in labs to advance scientific knowledge about disease pathology and treatment, I cannot help but think about my brothers and sisters in Tibet being forced to give their DNA to state police in their schools and educational centers with the very same Thermo Fisher equipment that I employ and use in my work. And I refuse to believe that placing profit over people is an inevitable trajectory of science. I refuse to join a research community whose work is complicit in an authoritarian regime's genocidal operations. Rather, I believe that we can conduct science ethically and that it is our paramount responsibility to always put people's livelihoods at the forefront of all the work that we do. And I frankly don't think that's a controversial nor impossible task to endeavor on and ask to make as a science student. And it starts with Thermo Fisher by upholding their, as Quincel was talking about, their corporate social responsibility and stopping their sales to this authoritarian regimes. It also entails educational centers, research centers, and other actors in the scientific community that stand, or at least claim to stand, for ethical science and are leaders in this field, but also buy DNA kits from Thermo Fisher and have a significant role as consumers in this manner to take a stand. As a science student, I'll lastly say, who doesn't want to see science go down this path, I just implore everyone in the science field to take action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and you really emphasized, your aspect of identity of being a science student, but all of these implications apply to all of us, I think, for sure, and that speaks to the future that you want to see as and how interconnected all of these aspects of your identity are. There's not one part of your identity that you bring to when you are attending your classes or such, and so thank you so much for bringing in that perspective and really your not necessarily requests, but rather your hopes for a future. And thank you. I want to bring in Kunsel here because let's talk about what happens when we don't take those actions. What happens when we don't invest in science that is ethical? And what are the potential long-term consequences of allowing this Chinese government to build such a comprehensive genetic database of Tibetans?
Thank you for that question. Yeah. I mean, China is known for policing, not only for Tibetans or Uyghurs, but also their own people. There are more than 1.4 billion people living in China who are constantly watched. Yet what's happening now is that this mass surveillance is in a manner never seen before. And in practice, this DNA database means that when any Tibetan goes against or even offends the Chinese Communist Party for any reason, their immediate and extended family with similar DNA could be treated as suspects and labeled as separatists. And that means that one of the few rights they still had, the right to bodily integrity, is something so fundamental, and it's now being taken away from them. And that means that while China is tightening their grip, it is effectively keeping Tibetans inside of Tibet in a chokehold. And Tibetans are afraid. They were already afraid to speak up. Yet now there's this additional risk of their entire family being flagged in a DNA database. The repercussions they face, will their 8-year-old niece face them as well? These effects are incredibly far-reaching, and the mass surveillance becomes more widespread. And that could impact activists outside of Tibet as well, who don't want to put their Tibetan relatives at risk. And even though they're outside of Tibet, they still are afraid. And that already scarce information flow coming out of Tibet, that will only diminish more.
Yeah, thank you. These companies operate as if they're just a single entity, but really these companies are in existence because of the various entities that make up their company, be it their shareholders, their consumers. And so really, when we take on such a campaign, there is a multi-pronged approach of taking on this campaign. And so that brings me to a question from the floor that says, what are some of the short-term and long-term goals for this campaign? Perhaps, Tile, have you tackled this?
Yeah, of course. I think the most important short-term goal for this Thermo Fisher campaign is for Thermo Fisher to definitely cut their ties to the CCP and their genocidal practices. And also for the long term, making sure that companies know that we will hunt after them if they will ever dare to help oppression or the oppressive system by the CCP inside Tibet. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You know, when we talk about campaigns, we definitely think about short term and long term. And long term, of course, is to not have anyone's DNA be forcibly collected in any part of the world. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that we live in such a world of where we value justice, freedom, the values of democracy, and fight against authoritarian regimes together, and we have such actions taking place. And in terms of short-term goals, you know, really holding companies like Thermo Fisher accountable. Thermo Fisher is a company that's based in the America, you know, the so-called land of free. And so really the short-term campaign is to make sure that no companies are in partnerships with this in such a brutal regime that is carrying out mass levels of oppression, and now this biometric repression taking place, not to mention what the implications could be in the future in terms of the genetic database that they're creating, which is the largest in the world. And so thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us today. It was such a pleasure talking to all three of you. I do want to give you the floor if you have any final words to add, perhaps maybe calls to action, and what the audience can do. And I just thank you for everything that you do.
Sure. I mean, I can briefly speak about, you know, as this panel comes to a near and you've absorbed all the information that you have, people who have joined, and you start thinking about how, you know, ways to move forward. And not everyone has a local Thermo Fisher office nearby, but the most tangible, immediate action that you can take and impact that will speak volumes if it's done in mass number is signing the petition. And that will probably be disseminated in whatever form we can. But that is one thing we can do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tang. Yeah, please go ahead, Chile or Kunze, add up, and then we'll wrap up the convo.
Yes. I think I would like to remind everyone that, you know, China is doing everything they can to erase our Tibetan identity. And by doing so, they're erasing a history of oppression, but more importantly, they're erasing a history of resistance. And we resist. Us Tibetans, we will continue to resist. And this campaign is yet another form of resistance. And you can become a part of that resistance and a part of our movement by signing petitions, by sending emails to Mark Casper. And I would like to call upon everyone to join our movement.
Yeah, I just wanted to repeat something I said before. Comment at Thermo Fisher's social media. Make sure they hear us. Tell your friends and family about everything inside Tibet, what's going on. Consider donating money to organizations which are involved in the Thermo Fisher campaign. If you're young and have a lot of Semshuk, I say it again, join TYAE or SFT or any other youth organization and also sign the petition. There are already like 25,000 signatures. Still, Thermo Fisher refused to accept it. So it seems like the more signatures we get, the more powerful it is, and maybe someday they will hopefully listen to us. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I have nothing else to add. You know, you folks have done it all. The more young folks watching here who hear about this continue to get involved, the more us organizers, advocates can do, right? The more signatures we have, the more actions are taking place, taking them on. So I see a lot of love coming in as well for you folks. Thank you so much for joining us. We had today a stellar panel. In sort of two parts. We had the expert panel, and we have all of these grassroots activists talking about their personal connections and why they care and why they do the work that they do in this movement, specifically in this campaign. Let me remind you folks, as we speak, China is currently in the works of creating the largest database, genetic database, and has been collecting DNA forcibly and blood samples forcibly from Tibetans. Almost 1/3 of the population of Tibet has been forcibly forced to experience this repression, this biometric repression, and we can't even start to fathom in the world that we're heading about the consequences that this will have. And so I want to thank you all for joining us in every part of the world for both parts of our talk today. This, again, talk was hosted by the International Tibet Network, along with collaborations with, of course, a multitude of organizations where you saw the expert panel and grassroots activists. So thank you once again. Reminder, calls to action. We have the petition. We have AGM actions constantly happening. Share and spread the word. Folks have been making videos in their local languages to Mark Casper, the CEO of Thermo Fisher, trying to hold them accountable. And so with this said, I want to leave you off with a last video by Thermo Fisher. And thank you again for joining us.
Hi everyone, my name is Vincent Orsan. I'm from Students for Free Tibet Bay Area.
Hi, I'm Yuntan and I'm a member of SFT LaSalle Academy, calling on Thermo Fisher Scientific, a US-based biometrics company, and its CEO Mark Casper to stop actively contributing to China's genocide against Tibetans.
Stop providing the Chinese government with tools of repression and genocide.
Thermo Fisher is selling DNA sequencers and DNA kits to Chinese state police to aid and abet in the forced collection of biometric data from Tibetans inside of Tibet.
The oppression that Tibetans face under the CCP is no secret, and in that context, collecting DNA samples from innocent Tibetans, from innocent 5-year-old Tibetans, is concerning.
Thermo Fisher and Mark Casper claims their DNA kits are only being used to collect the blood samples of criminals and rapists, but then why are they taking blood samples at preschools?
As many as 1.2 million Tibetans have had their DNA samples stolen.
The DNA collection campaign is part of an ongoing Chinese effort to build the world's largest police-run genetic database.
This increases surveillance and further violates Tibetan freedom.
Tibet is already classified as the least free country in the world, and Thermo Fisher's supply of DNA kits is feeding into this repressive system and further supporting China's occupation of Tibet.
Mark Casper. As the CEO of America's and the world's largest bioinformatics company, you have a responsibility to your employees, your firm, and your country to live up to the ethics of responsible science.
Instead of doing the right thing, you ignore our messages and delete our comments.
Mark Casper, stop putting profits over people.
Stop putting profits over people.
Mark Casper, stop putting profit over people.
Either stand with Tibet or stand with injustice. The choice is yours.
Stop actively contributing to China's genocide of Tibetans.
Thermo Fisher, stop aiding and abetting China in the repression and genocide of the Tibetan people.
Mark Casper, clearly your greed has compromised your values.
Stop supplying DNA equipment to the CCP.
Stop helping China steal Tibetan DNA.
Stop prioritizing profits at the expense of human rights.
We call on Thermo Fisher to respond in full to our concerns for the supply of their products to police forces in Tibet.
Mark Casper, how do you answer to the world and to us?